Hello, everyone. Welcome to your anatomy lecture for today. We are going to be looking at the urinary system, so let's go ahead and get started. So let's go ahead and see what we have here with the urinary system. And this system is an often very overlooked system because when people think about making urine, they, I don't know, don't think of it as a very important process. They don't think of it as something that affects their life that much. I mean, unless you really have to go really bad, but otherwise, like this system is not really thought of as one of the big systems in the forefront, like cardiovascular or nervous system, but the urinary system and making urine is actually a really important process. Like if you've ever heard of the kidneys and the renal system, this system is really important for making sure that you can manage your blood pressure, manage the contents of your blood, because this is basically what's filtering the blood. So let's go ahead and see what we have here with the urinary system, which, like I was saying, is otherwise known as the renal system. And the type of way that you might have heard of this term is renal failure. And that is not a good thing. Like, if you've ever heard of renal failure, hopefully not often, but this is something that can be like a really bad thing to happen to the body. Because if you look closely, like the renal system is going to have a lot of major functions. So we know that it makes urine, but what does it do while it's making urine? It helps with filtering the blood to eliminate waste. So stuff like nitrogenous waste that the body makes, such as nitrogenous metabolites from metabolizing proteins and so on. But then also it helps to regulate your blood pressure, your blood volume, and then other stuff in the blood as well, such as the blood pH, electrolytes, as in sodium, calcium to some extent, chloride. So those things that you need to also manage. But then also, like we talk about making urine, but something that's really important about the kidneys is that it can concentrate urine. And that's a little bit weird to say, but basically, you don't want to get rid of all of your water. And if it weren't for your renal system and your urinary system, you would just be peeing all the time. So let's go ahead and talk about that and its major structures. So to get started, you can see the kidneys here, and then you can also see they have these little structures that are going to be traveling down from the kidneys. These are called the ureters. So kidneys and ureters are going to be traveling down from the abdominal cavity to the urinary bladder, and then finally out through the urethra. So these are like the really big structures. And just to be clear, there is more to this. So let's go ahead and take a look at our kidneys. So the kidneys are a pair of these like large kidney bean shaped structures. Like they look like these large beans, but they're about the size of like a small fist. So the kidneys are pretty big, but they are also going to be like pretty complex. Like there's a lot that goes to them, such as layers and very, very small tubes inside of them. But the kidneys themselves are big kidney beans. They're going to be found along the back of the abdominal wall. And there's a term that we use to describe this, which is retroperitoneal. And that is a new term that we haven't really talked about too much, but retroperitoneal means that it's outside of the peritoneal cavity, rather retro behind it. So retroperitoneal means that it's behind the peritoneum. So this is actually kind of outside of the kind of abdominal lining, but it's still inside of the abdominal cavity. So you'll actually see it like right in the back of the abdomen, kind of along the sides of the abdominal aorta and the inferior vena cava. Now, to take a look at the kidney a little bit more, there's a couple more big structures that we can see here that we can look at before breaking down like the actual kidney tissue, which on the medial side of either kidney, you can see where all of the blood vessels and the ureter are going to be going in and out. that is called the hilum of the kidney. So the hilum of the kidney is where everything kind of goes in and out. It's just like an open space. And if you look at the cross section, you can see that kind of like openness here. This is just where all of the tubes go in and out. But then furthermore, there are these little cavities within the kidney, kind of like between some of these tubes. Those are called sinuses, just like how you think about sinuses in a bone. But the renal sinus in this case is typically filled with fat or like kind of like softer tissue, so that it helps with supporting the structures within the kidney. Now, finally, looking at the kidney tissue a little bit more, we can see that we have two major layers. And this is a system that we've seen multiple times in the semester. So if you remember the outer layer versus the inner layer, it's usually using the terms cortex and then medulla. So cortex, kind of like cerebral cortex, adrenal cortex, and in this case, we have renal cortex. So renal cortex is going to be the outer layer, which you can see is kind of a little bit of a lighter color, but you can also see this renal cortex kind of extends deeper into the kidney as well, but all of that is going to be considered renal cortex. But then you can see the shift in color. You can see like the gradation changes very drastically from like lighter colored along the edges here to a very darker color here. All of those darker colors collectively make the inner layer called the renal medulla. So the cortex is always the outside, the medulla is always the inside, and you can see that the colors are a really big indicator of which layer we're talking about. Now, looking at the cortex, and once again, the cortex is the outer layer, but you can also see those parts going inwards. That is the renal columns. So the straight portions that are leading deeper into the kidney, those are the renal columns. So you can still see the color, like it's still the same, but you can see it going deeper and forming these straight regions. Those are the renal columns. Now the layers, the renal medulla also has some parts that you need to be able to find as well, which if you look closely, kind of separating all of these different chunks of the renal medulla, that's when we get to these little structures called renal pyramids. Now I know what you imagine with a pyramid, like you can kind of see the shape of it, right? Like if you look at a pyramid from the side, but just to be clear, these do also mimic the pyramid where you have like a big rounded base and then you have a pointed part at the bottom. That is the pyramid shape. It's more like a cone, if anything, but you can see the renal pyramids are going to be these dark parts individually. But if you look closely, there is a part at the bottom of each of the renal pyramids. Those little bumps, those are renal papillae. So we've used the word papilla before as well. Think dermal papilla, papillary muscle. Papilla, like what shape are those? They are just little bumps. And this bump in particular is kind of at the very bottom of the renal pyramids, which is going to lead into the structures that the urine will then travel out from. So we'll go ahead and see those in just a second, but one last thing to point out really quickly. If you look at the border between the renal cortex and the renal medulla, this line, this kind of border between them, is kind of indicating a junction between them. So largely this rounded part, this is what's going to be called the cortico-medullary junction, which is where the cortex and the medulla are going to meet. So these two are going to be meeting at this border called the cortico-medullary junction. Now, leading out of the actual kind of like kidney tissue, I mean, technically we're still in the kidney, but not necessarily like the functional part where you're going to be modifying and making your urine. But now that we go into these tubes, I mean, this is basically urine now. So there's nothing you can do at this point, but you can see that urine comes out of the kidney, out of the renal papilla, and then it goes into these little tubes with starting off with these tiny little funnel ones. So at the bottom of each renal papilla, you'll have a minor calyx, which is the smallest one, and then basically they merge together to form the bigger one. So two minor calyces joining together, this will now be a major calyx. Same thing on this side, minor and minor, and then this is major. But then when all of the major calyces join together, one, two, three, all those major calyces join to this region right here, which is called the renal pelvis. So this is basically where all of the calyces, all of the funnels merge together to ultimately then start to narrow down and then form this tube which leads out of the kidney. And that tube is then going to be the ureter. So basically, if you're looking at the outside of the kidney, all you can really see is the kidney itself and then the ureter attached. And then that's going to travel down to the urinary bladder, which is going to be your storage area for urine. So this is going to be like basically a sac. This is a sac that can hold urine, but then finally you have the urethra, which will allow the urine to travel outward as well. Alrighty. So just as a review, you can see the kidney here. You can see all of the layers, cortex on the outside, medulla on the inside, and then you can see the columns of the cortex. You can see the individual pyramids of the medulla, and then maybe a little bit of the papilla as well, leading into the minor calyces, the major calyx, and then when the major calyces join together, renal pelvis, ureter, urinary bladder, and then urethra. So it's just important to remember, like this kidney, like when you look at the inside, has all this stuff in here. So it's actually pretty complex. So the kidney has a lot going on, and that's not the end of it. So let's keep going. But this is where it gets a little bit trickier. So if you need to, just kind of give yourself a break, recollect yourself. But I mean, what we'll look at next, things are going to get a bit small. So, I mean, however you need to prepare, but let's go ahead and get started. So, if you look closely at the kidney, and when I'm saying closely, I mean like really closely or microscopically, this is where you'll see these tiny, tiny little tubes. These tiny little tubes are called nephrons. Now, I haven't really used the word nephron too much, but if you remember, we did use the word nephropathy for kidney failure or kidney damage. That's basically damage to the nephrons when we say kidney damage. So affecting the nephrons effectively affects the functionality of the kidneys. So the kidney, or if you look closely, the nephrons are basically these tiny tubes, but they all start at these little blood vessels called the glomerulus, and then that is going to lead through this really weird looking long twisting tube to finally go down to the very bottom of the renal pyramid, the renal papilla, and then that's where it leads out of the kidney tissue. So once it leads out of the kidney tissue, it's basically urine. But along this long tube, there's a lot of stuff that's going to go on, such as number one, filtering the blood, but number two, like, well, putting things in and taking things out. Like, there's going to be a lot of adjusting of what you take out from your urine or from your blood, basically. But just to kind of give you the scope of like what the kidney does and what the nephrons do. So first of all, like you can see two nephrons here, but in the kidney or in each kidney rather, there's about 1 to 1.25 million nephrons. That means in your kidney or in both of your kidneys, you'll have about 2.5 million nephrons collectively. Now, when you think about like filtering your blood, like it's not just like, well, I filter some blood everywhere every once in a while. It's actually going on all the time. Like you are filtering your blood all the time, all day, every day, and in vast quantities. So your nephrons filter about 175 liters a day. And to give you an idea of what that is, like if you look at this water bottle, this is 500 milliliters. This is half a liter. So imagine 350 of these. This is what you're filtering every day. And just to be clear, you do not make 350 liters of urine every day. You probably make just a few, like maybe 2 to 3, if anything. And that is going to be perfectly normal. But the reason for that is because the kidneys actually filter the blood. Like a lot of stuff comes out, but your your kidneys also recollect the large majority of that, like about 99% of what comes out is recollected. All right. So looking at the kidney, you can see that there are some specific parts. So the kidney is going to be a long tube starting at this little thing called the renal corpuscle, which contains these little blood vessels called the glomerulus. And that's where you'll go through a series of tubes. The proximal convoluted tubule, the descending limb of loop of Henle, the ascending limb of loop of Henle, the distal convoluted tubule, and then also the collecting duct. Now, the thing about these is that they all look the same. Like a lot of these structures are hard to tell what's what unless you have some way of figuring out which one's which. So you always want to have some sort of reference point, as always in anatomy. So we're going to do the same here. And you can either look for two things. Look for either the big ball or with the blood vessels inside, because that means that this is the very beginning. But then, or on the other hand, you can look for this really long tube that goes straight down through the kidney. This is called the collecting duct. And if you can find the collecting duct, that would be the end of the nephron instead. So I'm going to reference to those, but I mean, let's go ahead and start looking at the actual structures as well. And let's go ahead and look at that renal corpuscle and glomerulus. So when you look at the renal corpuscle, there's two major things that goes with this. There is the outer part right here, which is going to be called the capsule, either called the glomerular capsule or the Bowman's capsule. But then glomerular capsule, that's something that we're going to be seeing a few times at the moment, because inside of the glomerular capsule, you have the glomerulus. So glomerular capsule, that is the round part on the outside, otherwise known as Bowman's capsule. But then glomerulus are the blood vessels inside. Now, these blood vessels are really, really small. This is where you have like a lot of exchange. So, I mean, what blood vessel does exchange? They're capillaries. But even more than that, though, it's not just normal exchange. These are not continuous capillaries. These capillaries actually have tiny little holes, which allows a lot of small, like solutes or small components of blood, as well as liquids to come out very quickly. So this is called a fenestrated capillary. So what I want you to imagine when you think of a fenestrated capillary is basically a tube, like a hose maybe. And then if you poke a lot of little holes into that hose, like that hose, I mean, it's still going to have a lot of stuff going through it, but there's going to be a lot of leakage out of those holes. And that's exactly what's happening here. Like you have a lot of leakage, basically blood is coming out, but the big stuff of blood stays in, like blood cells, proteins, large molecules, but small molecules such as glucose, water, sodium, chloride, all of those things are going to be able to exit the blood here or be filtered out. So, I mean, that stuff though, like that's not a lot of stuff, or a lot of that stuff you probably want to keep. So we'll get to that in just a minute. But basically, you're forming the filtrate here, which is the stuff that was filtered out of the glomerulus. Now, before we get into like the rest of the nephron, there's a little bit more kind of like small stuff to look at regarding the glomerulus, which like when you look at the glomerulus, there's basically your two layers as usual, a parietal and a visceral layer. So the parietal layer is actually the capsule itself. Like this would be the glomerular capsule, and then this would be the parietal layer, the outer layer. But then on the glomerulus, there's the inner layer, which is actually going to be made up of cells at this point. And those cells do have a special name, which are called podocytes. And the reason why they're called podocytes is because they have these little feet, and those feet actually like kind of form this mesh together. So when you imagine podocytes, they have these little like extensions coming off of them, and they will be able to kind of like mesh together, with the lack of a better word, and then form like this filtration, like, or this kind of like net around like the capillaries. This is going to be forming something called filtration slits, which is basically, once again, like because the fenestrations allow for a lot of stuff to come out, this once again helps to keep big stuff in. So this is going to be helping to form like a little mesh so that only certain things, only the small things get out from your glomerulus. So with a parietal layer and a visceral layer, you basically have like the same type of thing, but now you have a space between them. And that space, this empty region, is actually where the filtrate will come out of the blood and then be collected before it starts to move past or move through like the rest of the nephron. So if you look closely, the filtration membrane is going to be formed by both the fenestrations of the capillaries. So look closely, you can see all those little tiny holes, but then you can also see the filtration slits surrounding the capillaries formed by the podocytes. And this is once again going to help with keeping the large stuff in the blood while the small stuff does come out. And like we were saying earlier, like even though like you have like both of these that kind of like prevent stuff from coming out, a lot still comes out. So remember, 175 liters is filtered by your blood or filtered by your kidneys every day. And most of that you do not pee out. Like you keep most of that 175 liters. So the place where you actually recollect most of that is in the very next structure. So this is called the proximal convoluted tubule. So proximal convoluted tubule. This is going to be kind of a long term, but just think about those words for a sec. So convoluted tubule, first of all, like you might not know what the current convoluted means, but basically imagine something that's like a really long winding road. And that's basically what convoluted means. Like you can go from point A to point B like very quickly if you go across a straight line, but convoluted means that it's very long and winding and very unnecessary usually. So like imagine going like up and down, back and forth before you finally get to the end point at B. That's what convoluted means. Like very long, very winding, and usually pretty unnecessary. But in this case, necessary. And then this is a small tube. So once again, longer the term, smaller it is. This is called a tubule. So convoluted tubule. Now the word proximal means that we will also have the word distal involved here too. But when we think of the word proximal, think about like closer to the starting point. This is closer to the glomerulus. So if you look closely, this dark blue one versus this teal one, the dark blue one, you can actually see connected right here to the glomerulus, or rather connected to the renal corpuscle or the glomerular capsule. That means that this side is closer to the glomerulus than this side. So this one is the proximal one, while this one, spoiler, is going to be the distal one. Now, like we were saying, like there's a lot of filtrates being formed here, and most of that is going to be recollected right here in the very next step, the proximal convoluted tubule. So, like a lot of the stuff that I was talking about, you don't want that to be in your urine, like water, sugar, amino acids, even sodium and chloride and hydrogen ions to some extent. Most of that you're going to recollect at the proximal convoluted tubule. I believe it's about 70-ish% that you're going to recollect right at this next step. I mean, once it comes out, you want to recollect all that stuff that you want to keep. Like, it's not going to be everything. You don't like reabsorb all of the urea or all of the water if necessary or if unnecessary, but most of it is going to be recollected here. And the way that you can do that is through these specialized linings along the cells called microvilli. So I know it's been a while, but dig deep. And if you remember what microvilli are, they're the tiny little extensions coming off of the hair, or not coming off of the top of the cells. Those are basically just helping to increase surface area. But why do they increase surface area? To increase surface area for a reabsorption, basically. So this is something that you'll see in anything that's helping to absorb large quantities of like materials. And in the proximal convoluted tubule, there's a lot that you're trying to recollect because you don't want to lose all that water and all the sugar and all the amino acids that that you're hoping to use in the body. So far we have the renal corpuscle and the proximal convoluted tubule. But next we have the loop of Henle. So loop of Henle, there is another word that we use for this, which is nephron loop, but use the term that is in the lab manual. And if you look closely, there's two sides to the loop of Henle. You'll have the descending limb of the loop of Henle and the ascending limb of the loop of Henle. Now, look closely at this loop. Look at this like big U shape or this hairpin loop. This like does not give you a lot to go off of. Like you don't know which side is which very clearly. So what you need to do once again is use what they're attached to. So in this case, you kind of have to use two steps because otherwise, like you're just at the convoluted tubule. But if you look at this side or this side, just look at what they're connected to. And if we follow it back to like one of our two big reference points, we can figure out which one's which. So this one over here, this is connected to this dark blue tube. And then if we follow this dark blue tube, we can see that it's going to, through this winding route, finally get back to the glomerular capsule. That means that this is the proximal convoluted tubule, and that means that this is going to travel this way from the proximal convoluted tubule down down the descending limb of loop of Henle, and then this side must be the ascending limb of loop of Henle. But you can do the same thing on this side as well, where on this case, it's connected to the distal convoluted tubule, and then also the collecting duct. So you can look at either side, but you just need to know like if it's connected to one or the other, it'll either be ascending or descending. Now, before we get into the rest of the nephron, although I won't talk about this too much, there is actually a little bit of a difference in what these parts will do. So I know one part brings it down, one part brings it back up, but this is actually something I want you to know. So in the descending limb of the loop of Henle, it's going to be permeable to water. What that means is that it's going to allow water to pass through it. And that means that this is where you can reabsorb more water. Because remember, 175 liters, like that's a lot. And you need to reabsorb even more. And especially if like you like are low on water, you're dehydrated, this is what's going to allow you to reabsorb more water. And it's a very specialized process that it does that, but I'm not going to get into that in this class. Like, look forward to that in physio, but this is going to be where you reabsorb water so that you can concentrate your urine, basically. Like, you don't want to lose that water. You want to concentrate your urine by taking out the water, but leaving everything else. Now, something that's going to help with that, but I won't explain it here, but if you look closely, you have the ascending limb loop of Henle on the other side, and this is going to not be permeable to water, but this is where you're going to be able to reabsorb sodium. This is where you're going to be able to reabsorb salts. And that, in fact, is actually very important to the kidney, but just know that between the two sides, descending limb of loop of Henle reabsorbs water, ascending limb of loop of Henle reabsorbs salts. So you can see the nephron loop here. Like, this long tube goes deep into the kidney, and basically, the saltier it is around your nephron loop, the more water you're going to be able to reabsorb. So the ascending limb of loop of Henle reabsorbs salts, and then that allows you to basically kind of like, with the lack of a better word, kind of like suck out like the water from the descending side. But look closely, all along like the kidney and the nephron, you'll see these little blood vessels surrounding it. This is called the vasa recta, which we'll talk about later, but this is basically where you're going to recollect a lot of that material coming out of your loop of Henle. Now, as promised, you had a proximal convoluted tubule, so you also have a distal convoluted tubule. And the distal convoluted tubule is the one not connected to the glomerulus. So if you look at the distal convoluted tubule, it is actually connected to this other long straight tube called the collecting duct. So this is the one that's further from the glomerulus. So look closely and follow what those tubes are connected to, and you'll be able to figure out which one's which. But looking at the distal convoluted tubule, I mean, once again, it looks very similar, just it's connected to the collecting duct instead. And the distal convoluted tubule is a little different from the rest of your other parts of the nephron because this one actually can put stuff back in to the into the urine as well. So the filtrate runs through here, and depending on what your body needs, it actually could put stuff back in to the filtrate, but it can also do reabsorption as well. Now, finally, we lead to this really long tube, which actually has a bunch of nephrons connected to it. Like, this is where everything collects, and like this is called the collecting duct. So the collecting duct you can see traveling straight down through the kidney, all the way from the cortex, through the medulla, and then finally even into the papilla, where it leads to, as its name suggests, the papillary duct. So all of those nephrons, like those tubules, the loops, all of them finally lead into the collecting duct, and then that collecting duct leads all the way down through the cortex and medulla into the renal papilla, where it changes names into papillary duct, which finally, if you look closely, little hard to see, will lead out of the actual kidney tissue into a minor calyx. So a minor calyx will be right at the bottom of the renal papilla, and it releases basically what you've been filtering the whole time. And this is where it's going to be released into urine. Now, one last thing to mention regarding these, like the collecting duct, it also does have functionality, which is mostly to reabsorb more water. So in fact, if you remember the hormone anti-diuretic hormone, the one that helps you to retain water, this is the one that does it. Like, this is the one that is mostly affected by ADH, although there are a couple other parts. And this is where you can reabsorb even more water through the collecting duct. So once again, that's important, like really important. But let's go ahead and take a look at some stuff that goes along with nephrons as well. So if you look closely, there are kind of two major types of nephrons. There's the one that has the long loop, and then the one that has a shorter loop. So the one that has a shorter loop is actually more in the cortex. So this is called a cortical nephron. And this is actually the majority of your nephrons. But if you need to reabsorb more stuff, if you need to reabsorb more water and concentrate your urine, like a lot of your juxtamedullary nephrons will be used instead. What that means is that the juxtamedullary nephrons will be right next to the medulla, and they'll have these long loops of Henle, and this is going to be allowing you to really, really concentrate the urine down here. So when we talk about reabsorption, like we talk about stuff being taken out from the filtrate, but where does that stuff go? And most stuff that's traveling in the body is going to go through blood vessels, and this is no exception. So if you imagine like you have blood vessels surrounding the nephrons, and if you have any type of absorption or exchange, I mean, hopefully we know what type of blood vessels those will be. They're going to be surrounded by tiny little capillaries. So if you look closely, there are these really, really small blood vessels surrounding both loop of Henle and the convoluted tubules. And those are going to have a little bit of a different name, but they will also be largely separated by their layer that they're found within as well, because I mean, the structures are found in different parts as well. So let's actually review that so we can kind of see that more clearly. So if you look closely, you have the convoluted tubules, both proximal and distal. These are going to be found in the renal cortex. But if you look closely, there are these small little blood vessels surrounding them. So surrounding the proximal and distal convoluted tubules, around the tubules, there are peritubular capillaries. So peritubular capillaries are surrounding the tubules, and like all that stuff that comes from the PCT and DCT goes into these blood vessels. Now, mentioned earlier, but if you look closely, there's kind of like this ladder-like structure traveling right along with the loop of Henle. This is in the renal medulla. So the loop of Henle, for the most part, is in the renal medulla, and likewise, the vasa recta, the blood vessels that surround it, will also be in the renal medulla as well. So you've got the peritubular capillaries surrounding the PCT and DCT, the peritubular is surrounding the tubules, and then vasa recta surrounding the loop of Henle. This is going to be the long ladder-shaped structure around these big long tubes. Now, there's a little bit that goes along with this though, because blood flow in the kidneys is really important. So we do have to talk about this blood flow as well. So it does get a little bit tricky sounding, but once you look at it, it's actually not too bad. But let's go ahead and look at some of these blood vessels. So looking at the kidney, you can see that you have this big blood vessel coming in. And in most cases, and in this case, the red one will be the artery. So the word for kidney is renal, and this would be the renal artery. Now, if you look closely, the renal artery is going to branch out right here and here. These are called segmental arteries. So the segmental arteries are going to be the parts that come off of the renal arteries, and these are going to lead deeper into the kidney tissue. Now, this is where it gets a little bit more specific, like when it goes between the renal pyramids within the renal column area. This one is called the interlobar artery. So renal artery, segmental artery, and then between the renal pyramids, interlobar artery. Now I want you to kind of keep this word in mind real quick, because there's another one that sounds like it, but this is interlobar. which then runs along like the top of the pyramid, along that corticomedullary junction. This is called the arcuate artery. So arcuate, I like to think of like an arc, kind of like rounded at the top. Same thing here. This is the arcuate artery running along the top of the medulla at the very edge between medulla and cortex. But then look closely, and there's these tiny little ones that come out from the arcuate artery. These right here, these are called interlobular arteries. So now remember, we had one right in the previous slide called interlobar. These smaller ones are called interlobular. So I know, I'm sorry, it's just how it is, but interlobular, remember, the longer the word, usually the smaller it is, and in this case, it's no exception. So interlobular artery, but look closely, coming off the interlobular artery, this is where we get into some very important areas, like this tiny little artery that actually leads into the glomerulus. This is called the afferent arteriole. So remember, we have an artery. The small arteries are arterioles. This is the afferent arteriole because it's going into the glomerulus. So remember, afferent goes in. What goes out? Efferent. So afferent arteriole is the bigger of the two arterioles. Afferent arteriole goes into the glomerulus. This is where you have all of the filtration, all of the filtrate production, all the stuff comes out of the blood, but then that blood does continue because remember, not everything comes out. Those blood vessels or the blood cells, as well as more water, continues to go out of the glomerulus into the efferent arteriole. So you have afferent arteriole goes into the glomerulus, efferent arteriole goes out. Now, this brings, once again, something that's kind of tricky, like which one's which? Like they look very similar. They look very, very similar, but there is a couple distinctions to make. Number one, size. So if you look closely, the afferent arteriole is bigger than the efferent arteriole. You can see that the afferent arteriole is a little bit wider than the skinnier efferent arteriole, which makes sense in the line of arteries. Like we go from smaller or bigger and then branching to smaller and smaller. And then along those same lines, sometimes you'll even see that the efferent arteriole will branch out. So the afferent arteriole comes from the interlobular artery, but the efferent arteriole will actually branch out to our next structures, which are the small capillaries, which are the peritubular capillaries and the vasa recta. So if you look closely, like between these two, even without the arrows, you can see this blood vessel is branching out to these smaller blood vessels. That means that this has to be efferent arteriole. And that is going to go into this case, the peritubular capillaries, or, and sometimes the vasa recta. So we talked about these. These are the capillaries. These are the capillary beds where you can recollect stuff. But look closely. Now that we have gone through the capillary beds, it turns from red to blue. So guess what? Now we've got veins. But luckily, the veins are basically named the same way. So if you look closely, the vasa recta and the peritubular capillaries will then lead to the interlobular veins, just like interlobular arteries. And then once again, along like the arch here, arcuate veins, just like the arteries. And then once again, what's after arcuate or before arcuate and arteries? Interlobar vein. So interlobar vein. And then this is where there's one tiny little like discrepancy, which is that there is no segmental veins. It just goes into renal veins from there on. So the veins are very similar to arteries. So if you can figure out one side, you got both, but just got to look at it carefully. Now, along with those blood vessels, there's a couple things that go kind of like hand in hand with it, which are these regulatory cells, which are collectively called the juxtaglomerular apparatus. So that's one of the funnest words of the whole semester. And it's not that bad if you break it down again, because when you look at it, it's multiple parts. So you got to start off with glomerular because that's hard enough in its own thing. So glomerular, glomerular. And then add in juxta now, juxtaglomerular apparatus. Now, if you remember what the word juxtaposition means from like, high school English or something, it means like two things kind of like side by side, and often they're compared, but in this case, this is just something right next to the glomerulus. And this structure, in this case, is going to help with regulating blood pressure using two things. So look closely. This bigger arteriole is the afferent arteriole, and inside of its ball, these are the juxtaglomerular cells. So the juxtaglomerular cells are largely localized along the walls of the afferent arteriole. But then if you look closely, there's this other tube over here. Now this is kind of weird because, I mean, you'd probably expect something that's connected to the renal corpuscle, right? But this, in fact, is actually the distal convoluted tubule. And I'll show you that in a minute, but this is actually something that happens regularly. The distal convoluted tubule, is really winding and goes everywhere, but it does come back and kind of like run right along the renal corpuscle. And this is where there will be some cells in here called the macula densa. So this is where you're actually going to be able to regulate blood pressure using, well, down the line hormones called like aldosterone. Well, yeah, let's just say that this is related to aldosterone, but macula densa in the distal convoluted tubule, juxtaglomerular cells in the afferent arteriole. So basically, this will help with regulating blood pressure in a few different ways. Like number one, it helps with releasing something called renin, and it stimulates a cascade called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. So once again, good luck in physio, but otherwise, renin is going to be helping you to ultimately increase blood pressure. Like if the blood pressure in your kidneys or in your glomerulus is too low, you're actually going to need to increase that. So you can do that by reabsorbing salts. You can do that through vasoconstriction. You can do that by reabsorbing more water. So all of those things are going to be enacted due to the effects of renin coming from your juxtaglomerular cells and your juxtaglomerular apparatus. All right, so we have made urine. Like we filtered the blood, we recollected 99% of that stuff, but the rest of that 99% does get released as urine, and that fluid is going to come out from these little things called the minor calyces to the major calyces, and then into the renal pelvis and the ureter. Now the ureters are basically tubes, but they actually do have their own anatomy to them as well, in that they will actually have some amount of like muscular tissue in them to help with undergoing something called peristalsis to push the urine down like from the kidneys towards the urinary bladder. Now the urinary bladders will actually go like along like the sides and bottom of the kidneys, or sorry, the bladder, so that it does not like tangle up. So it's actually going to go to the bottom of the bladder, and then that's it where it's going to then release into it so that the bladder can then store the urine. Now, the bladder basically is like just a sac, or rather a muscular sac. And in this case, it also does have these little folds in it called rugae, which are going to help with allowing it to stretch as well. So the bladder has rugae, allowing it to stretch and expand, because that's helpful when you have a fluid that's accumulating inside of here. Like you don't want it to pop necessarily. You want it to just be able to stretch so it can hold more fluid if ever necessary. Now, the bladder in male versus female bodies is slightly located differently because female bodies have an organ that the male does not, and that would be the uterus. So the uterus and then the vagina is going to be actually right behind the urinary bladder, while for the males without that, like the rectum will actually be right behind the bladder instead. Oh, sorry, one last thing. For the urinary bladder, or for the male bodies at least, there is actually something that male bodies have that female bodies don't, and that's called the prostate. So if you do look closely, this guy actually is a prostate or has a prostate. So that means that this is a male body. But you can see that prostate right underneath the urinary bladder. Now, remember the bladder has a little bit of anatomy. It is a muscular sac, but remember it does have those folds of the rugae inside of it. It also does have the ureters connecting to the urinary bladder down here, and then you can also see a long tube, or rather a tube, that's going to be traveling from the bottom of the bladder called the urethra. So you can kind of see like this triangle formed by the two ureters connecting in the urethra. This is called the trigone. Now, finally, the urethra. This is where the urine is going to leave the body. This is basically how you release the urine, like whenever you need to urinate. And just to be clear, it is slightly different between male and female bodies, which in that for the female body, it's actually quite short. I mean, it just goes from the urinary bladder to the bottom of the pelvis, and that's about it. But for the urinary or for the male urethra, there's actually going to be three parts to it. But furthermore, it's going to be a bit longer. Like you can see the urethra traveling down from the urinary bladder, but it also has to travel through the prostate, through like the urogenital diaphragm, and then finally down through the penis as well. So it is actually a bit longer in male bodies. And this is something that also kind of like plays a role into something that you might be familiar with, which is that like between male and female, like between guys and girls, like it is actually easier for women to get UTIs or urinary tract infections. Like the reason for that is basically just the length of the urethra. Like the closer the urethra is to like other openings, such as the vagina and even the anus to some extent, like that actually can lead to more urinary tract infections. And then furthermore, it's a much shorter distance from the outside of the urethra to the urinary bladder, which can then affect the bladder much more easily as well. Like it's going to take quite a bit of distance in order for it to go from the like penis all the way to the bladder. But there's only a few inches that it would need to go from the pelvis to the bladder, like for the female body. So that's why it's important to have like good hygiene for, you know, the genital area. But it's much easier for UTIs to be affecting women instead of like men. So when you look at the urethra, there are actually a couple muscles that are really, really important here, which are called urethral sphincters. And you have the internal urethral sphincter, which is the one that's deeper. You can see that right here. And then you have an external urethral sphincter, which is right along like the outside over here. So these are basically the sphincters that help with controlling your urination. And the first one, the internal urethral sphincter, is actually involuntarily controlled. Like this one is contracting basically all the time, unless your bladder starts to stretch. So when your bladder starts to stretch, that's going to be indicating that you've got a lot of urine in there, and you should start thinking about releasing that. So the internal urethral sphincter just does its thing and opens up, and that's going to be a bit uncomfortable. But luckily, that doesn't mean that you're going to pee like right away. You have the external urethral sphincter, which is voluntarily controlled, which will be right over here along the sides of the external urethral sphincter, which will be able to allow you to basically hold it. Like it will allow you to hold it so that you can hopefully find a bathroom and you can keep that contracted until you can release it in a more appropriate space. So internal urethral sphincter and external urethral sphincters, they do help with holding urine, but internal urethral sphincter will be involuntarily controlled, while the external urethral sphincter, the one that you can control, allows you to hold it. Now, lastly, just to like finish up with like the urethra and their comparisons, like I was saying, the female urethra is a bit shorter, while the male urethra is longer. And that's basically just like due to the penis mostly. Because if you look closely, the male urethra actually has three different regions that it has to travel through: the prostatic urethra, the membranous urethra, and then the penile urethra. So, with that said, I mean, the urinary system is actually really important, and hopefully you have a better idea like how urine is made and why urine is made. But that's about it for today. Thank you for listening. Good luck with your study, and I'll see you all next time.